One of the things I've learned about mental health is that you start to feel bad, then you feel guilty and bad about feeling bad.
Yeah.
And that can actually become worse. And then you just spiral downwards, right?
Yes.
And so you've got to validate the fact that you feel bad.
So you're not going out of your mind, not being able to exercise?
I'm trying to do a lot, but just basic strength stuff to just keep my but what's interesting is that I got quite angry about it.
Yeah.
And I don't think in my case it was that I'm one of these people that has to exercise in order to maintain some equilibrium. I think that is true for some people.
Yeah.
But I did actually come to realize that this injury and the incapacitation that comes with it, and a couple of other disabilities that I struggle a bit with, has made me realize that I am treating my body as a means to an end. Even when I'm treating it well, it's in order to secure another end, right? And so there's this idea that, maybe we should talk about this, brains on a stick, right?
Yeah.
And although, and it goes completely contrary to my kind of faith tradition now as well, which is very much about the embodied experience, I realized that the reason I was mad was because in order to do the work I'm supposed to be doing intellectually,
Yes.
and this, right, I need my body to function, but it's still completely instrumental, right? It's not. I don't care. I realize I still
Your body was getting in the way of your mind. That's why you were mad.
Yes, and I actually think even when I'm the big realization for me was that if you'd said to me you're just treating your body, you're not treating your body well enough, I'd say that's not true. I do treat it well now, but still in the service of something else, rather than because it matters in and of itself.
Yes. Yeah, I rolled my ankle really bad in January, and then, they were like, take a couple weeks off, and I took a week off, and then I rolled it extremely bad, and I had to take 5 or 6 weeks off.
Oh, okay.
And it's very clear to me that I use running, some form of high intensity cardio as my serotonin adjustment. And if I don't have it, I can go maybe a day and it's a problem. And so I did some strength training stuff, but that doesn't do it for me.
You need the aerobic to get the kind of endorphin kick or the dopamine.
Yeah. So which is, it's on the one hand, not great. The Stoics would say sort of anything that you're dependent on or a slave to is bad or is a problem. And yet it's weird because it's one of those things that's positive. It's good for you, but it's probably not good for you to not be able to not do things.
But don't you also point out that the Stoics say you can never be perfect Stoic?
Yes.
Right?
I don't think
you have a whole thing about anti-perfectionism in there too.
Yeah.
Which is right.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, what I had to take the challenge of, the rehab of the ankle for me, and ankle injuries are weird because when I heard it the second time, it hurt so bad. I thought when I looked down, I would see my bones sticking out. And then, so I ended up going to the ER or whatever. And they're like, oh, it's just an ankle sprain. And I was like, please tell me it's worse. This is there was just the.
You feel invalidated.
Yeah, I was like, give me something.
I had exactly the opposite experience where I took it in originally and they x-rayed it and they missed the break in the leg. And said, yeah, you probably just, right. And sent me out. And 2 weeks later, I'm still walking around and then I went back. I said, this is I was walking around, I felt and they went, oh, yeah, you've broken your leg. Oh, by the way, you've destroyed your ankle.
You're like, oh, I am tough.
Oh, yeah. Then I'm like, but I was working for so I'm the opposite to you. I'm the real man here.
But I was like, oh, the challenge is how can I not be miserable to live with for a month as I'm I was like that to me that I had to
because you're going to become you're going to become a different person basically. And how did you manage it?
I tried to go, okay, this is my coping thing. So it's going away. So when I'm getting frustrated or I tried to be really cognizant that I wasn't just channeling that energy into nitpicking about stuff or being anxious about it's clearly I use that physical thing as an outlet for energy that otherwise could be destructive or unpleasant or just annoying. And I was like, okay, I'm just gonna, that's my problem. I can't just because I can't spill it on the pavement, I don't get to just spill it on my spouse or my
Okay.
employees or my editor.
So you noticed, so you just observed yourself starting to feel that and tried to.
Yeah, and then I was like, okay, now what?
So where do you go with it? Yeah.
Well, and
just
then I also
start
had to go-
start drinking heavily. I mean, that's the thing, right?
I don't have. I know. I wish I.
Just
sometimes
take
I
it.
wish I did.
Yeah, I used to.
I don't. I didn't have. I. What was I going to say? I wanted to also go. Okay, this is a. Imagine it's like this forever. What's the low intensity thing you're replacing it with?
Oh, that's interesting.
And so
Yeah, because if you had something called a permanent,
Yeah.
that meant you couldn't. I mean, when I was walking out, I felt sorry for myself because the surgery was bigger than they thought it was going to be, and so I came out and we had these plans for vacations and stuff, and like we're going to have to basically cancel all that.
Sure.
And the recovery is going to be much longer than I thought, and so I'm sort of moping a bit as we're coming out, like all this, and then as these things often do, this moment occurs to you, which is very instructive. So I'm getting in the elevator to go down, feeling sorry for myself, and then the guy who follows me into the elevator and is like cheerful doesn't have a leg.
Yes.
And I thought about telling him how unfair life was about my ankle surgery on my left leg, and then I realized that might not go down with a guy that doesn't have a left leg at all.
Yes.
And then you're like, okay.
It could always be worse is true, but not always so comforting.
No, well, it's also not like, you know how like if your parents would say to you if you didn't eat your food, or there are people starving in China, or somehow if you're depressed about the thing that's in your life, it doesn't invalidate.
Yeah.
So I was my feelings were not invalidated by the fact that it's not as bad as losing your leg, but they were helped. It helped me to, like, I didn't suddenly start beating up on myself for feeling bad. One of the things I've learned about mental health is that you start to feel bad, then you feel guilty and bad about feeling bad.
Yeah.
And that can actually become worse. And then you just spiral downwards, right?
Yes.
And so you've got to validate the fact that you feel bad.
Yeah.
And it's okay to feel bad, even though somebody else next to you could be rolling their eyes at you. Otherwise, it's almost like people who have problems when they don't feel that they somehow kind of should have problems. End up in that really difficult spiral. I've noticed that with some friends.
That is a masculinity problem. There's a difference between saying, "Hey, don't be ruled by your emotions," and pretend you don't have the emotions, right? Like or the stuff the emotions down and shrug them off. I think that's a problem. It's I think what you're feeling a thing, you're seeing someone else, you're getting some perspective on your feelings. And then you're just kind of working through and processing it. That's what you're supposed to do with the emotions, to me.
Yeah.
It's this kind of dialogue with the self.
Yeah, and observe the emotion. So you're in conversation with the emotion, but it's not, the emotion's neither dominating you nor to be dismissed. And there is this kind of difficult ground. I think you're right. A lot of men struggle with that. And actually, one of the things I want to ask you about is how the word stoicism is used in relation to men and masculinity. Yes. Because of course you've got.
But didn't the American Psychological Association, when they put down the traits of toxic masculinity, I think stoicism was number 2.
Yeah, it was.
But they're referring to lowercase stoicism.
They really are.
And I've said this before, but I think it's funny. Stoicism and Epicureanism, like Stoic and Epicurean, those two words in the English language are like the opposite of what the philosophies were about.
Yes.
And it's one of those things where, the word means the opposite of what people think it means.
Yeah.
And so it gets a bad reputation. I would agree Stoic, as the way they were defining it, is a trait of unhealthy masculinity. Stoicism, the thing I write about, the people I idolize, I wouldn't describe with that word necessarily.
Yes. Yeah, well, that's what happens. It's the same with the sophists, actually. I have a friend who's maybe going to write a book about sophistry.
Yeah.
And that's just all about, like, basic. Someone who's engaging in sophistry is kidding you, right? Snake oil salesman. And so it has that association. But his claim, anyway, is if you go back to it, doesn't much about the art of rhetoric and how you think about argument, etc. But these terms take on a life of their own. And so it sounds defensive when you say it, but like, well, it depends what you mean by but I also, I mean, even in that narrow, like, lowercase stoicism, I think that idea of, like, sometimes it is appropriate to have sort of emotional restraint and an ability, right?
The Stoics say the greatest empire is command of oneself. And I do think both genders, all people, would be better off if they were more in command of themselves. And so if that's how we're defining it, like I say Stoicism is not emotionlessness, but it is aimed at being less emotional. Because very rarely are we like, when we look back at a time when we were carried away by our emotions, or we like, I'm so glad I did that, positive or negative. Like the idea of, I think the ancients talked a lot about the passions as a bad thing, and today we talk about passion as like the main thing you should be cultivating.
Follow your passion.
Yeah, and it's blinding and overwhelming and can be deceiving. And so when I do something because I'm angry, or because I'm jealous, or I'm worked up, or I'm scared, anxious, that doesn't tend to age very well. I'm like, oh, that was dumb.
Yeah.
I haven't turned down the volume.
Do you ever get accused of it being a very masculine thing? Like
Totally.
they're all men, and like of course a man would say command, self-command, and whatever is what you'd say, because that's more of a masculine way of being in the world, and that it actually elevates that philosophical framework above a different framework, which would give emotions much more space. I'm thinking a bit about even someone like Martha Nussbaum, the philosopher's written about emotions and the intelligence contained within emotions. And a lot of the feminist philosophy would say, actually, that whole focus on command the emotions so that the brain, so that we can be rational, is actually squeezed out a lot of feminist and more women-centered philosophy.
Yeah, I mean, my wife likes to joke that one of us is a Stoic and the other writes about Stoicism, and so she's actually much more in control of her emotions, and for me, it's a thing I have to work on. Right. But I think it's interesting. We don't think of like Zen Buddhism as a masculine or feminine philosophy, but it says a lot of the same things about sort of watching those emotions happen and observing them and not being ruled by them. I wonder if it's a cultural distinction, or it's like an East-West thing. But again, we don't think of if anything, we the same practices might even have a slightly more feminine connotation to us, even though the idea of like letting those passions sort of pass on by like clouds, one is just a softer way of expressing, I think, a very similar idea of not being ruled by those emotions.
Interesting. Yeah.
I have a sense of the distinction you're talking about in your work from my audience, because people think it's all men, and yet who's actually really focused on self-improvement, succeeding at the office? Like I hear from so many really successful, ambitious, like put together women, because they are dominating in so many spheres. So it's actually, I would think people would be surprised at how much how female the Daily Stoic audience is, and how interested many women are in these ideas, because they are in, like, what I like about Stoicism is a philosophy designed not for the monastery or, it was designed for people who were running the empire, right? Which is the West today. Yeah. And so if you're, suddenly, as successive generations have gone, now you have more and more women in place of leadership. They're having to learn and avail themselves of some of the timeless wisdom that humans have developed for these positions of influence and power, and I think are turning to things like Stoicism to figure it out.
Yeah, I'm very interested in things like, well, anyway, maybe we should probably...
No, just keep... This is it. We're in it.
Are we?
Yes.
I didn't get any warning.
No. I just get it. And then if
we're on the record,
if there's stuff you don't like, we can cut it.
Okay, yeah. Well, I actually had this interesting conversation with Carol Hooven, who wrote a book about testosterone.
Yeah.
And she talked about this evidence around differences in crying. Yeah. And how she was criticizing this idea that probably men, they don't cry enough. Yeah. Right. And I've been on podcasts where they say, "When did you last cry?" Yeah. And the only acceptable answer is yesterday.
Like, right. It's bad. You're supposed to virtue signal that you do cry.
Absolutely.
Yes, sure.
That's required now. Yeah. And interestingly, I cry much less now that I've stopped drinking. Sure. I think for me, like, actually drinking was one way that it kind of made it a bit more permeable, maybe. And you might say, okay, that's bad that you're not crying as much, but what Carol's work shows is that, like, holding the same kind of emotional position roughly constant is that women are somewhat more likely to cry than men. Yeah. Right. And I have actually found that quite helpful in both directions, like, because if you apply a sort of male standard about what crying signals in terms of where you are on the emotional scale, and a woman comes into you as has happened to me in the workplace, and is in tears, you're going to think, whoa, this is really bad.
Yeah.
Right? Because you apply a sort of male standard to it. But
It must
actually,
be serious, or she
must be
wouldn't crying.
serious, yeah. Or you might be a bit judgmental about it, or keep yourself together or whatever. And so I find that quite helpful because it allows me to contextualize, and it could be men as well too, right? But I was aware that I might have inadvertently ended up with a kind of male-centric standard of what justifies tears, right?
Yes.
But of course, it could be true the other way around as well, which is like, oh, this terrible thing's happened to you. Like, why aren't you crying?
Yeah.
Right? And it must be because
You're stunted.
you're stunted, you can't express yourself. And so, like, you know, and so it's a great example, I think, of this difference, which at the average is just seems to be real.
Yeah.
And where we want to be very careful not to create cultures or environments where one is seen as somehow superior to the other, whether that's not crying or crying, right? So in a patriarchy, you're like, these emotional women constantly coming into my office and crying all the time. Like, no wonder we can't make a profit. But another culture might be like, well, these guys, like, even though something terrible just happened, he's not crying, right? So he's clearly emotionally stunted and unable to express his feelings, and so he's probably got some problems. And both of those are equally bad as a way to think about humans.
Well, I think about that because we have such an interesting... So let's say crying is being overwhelmed by an amount of emotion that you have. I don't think that's a weird way to define it, but you feel something so intensely, you're having like a physical reaction to it. So on a masculine scale, we say that's somewhat negative, or that's a loss of control. Maybe it's somewhat more positive when women do it. But then if you look at other things that we judge, it's the same thing, but we judge it differently with men. Like, I've said this before, but if you get so angry you punch a wall, that's like very masculine, right? Maybe it's not immediately judged, but we're like, there's something about that. And then I don't know, you have an affair. Like, there's different
How
forms.
did you go from punching a wall to having an affair?
I'm just saying you're overwhelmed by you're overwhelmed by an emotion, you like a feeling of lust or attraction.
Yeah, okay.
So in these different cases, like, one is considered unmanly, say like crying, and then others we might judge as good or bad, but we wouldn't say are unmanly or not. Right. And so I think it's interesting how, like, crying is this thing that men don't do. But if men lose their temper and get in a fight, that is what men do. But it's still losing command of oneself. And so I just think it's interesting how certain emotions are indulged in culture and then others are not.
Yeah, that is interesting. And it's also in the context of mental health, this idea of externalizing versus internalizing.
Yeah.
I've been talking to a lot of people recently about what's been happening, particularly to the mental health of young men and teenagers, etc., and how actually the measures that we use to try and get at what's happening with mental health can inadvertently capture one more than the other, because boys and young men tend to externalize.
Yeah.
They act out.
Right.
Whereas with women, and again, these are all at the average, of course, tend to be more internalizing. And so it's more about feelings of sadness. But if you take the main CDC measures of like mental health, they only ask internalizing questions. And so there's a lot of attention right now to the share of young women, for example, that are feeling persistent sadness.
Yeah.
But they don't ask about acting out. So don't ask about, did you punch a wall?
Yeah.
Right. Did you do something like more externalizing? And there's a tendency sometimes to see that as, well, that's just antisocial behavior. But
they're symptoms of the same problem.
Yes. It's just a different expression of the two. And so if you have survey instruments that pick up one and not the other, or you sort of see one as a mental health problem, the other as a punitive problem, like in the classroom, say, then you've inadvertently built into your mental health system some discrimination against what's happening with boys. And one of the other interesting things that really happened was that during the pandemic, actually, boys didn't have as much kind of opportunity to externalize.
There's less fights to get into.
Yes, and so some of the mental health people I'm talking to now are saying, like, there was this basically this kind of suppressed mental health problems, or you couldn't see them as much with boys because the way they would normally have expressed them weren't available to them.
Yes.
Now, good or bad, but it just seems like that was a factor in this apparent gender gap in mental health, because I'm absolutely convinced that the mental health problems of teen boys are every bit as great as teen girls.
Yes.
Even if they're expressed differently, but that's not the current narrative.
Well, what you look for and what you expect is going to change what you see. My wife was telling me she was looking at something, and it was like how underdiagnosed ADHD is in women versus
Yes.
men, or
Yes.
was historically.
Yeah,
And it's like,
historically.
if you
Yeah.
don't have high standards or you don't care, like if you're not expecting them to do well in school, it's not important to you, you're not going to notice that they're not paying attention as well. And so, yeah, what you're expecting is going to change what you're looking for. And so I do think, though, if I was there, because there's this interesting passage in Marcus Aurelius' Meditations where he talks about how it's not manly to lose your temper. And I think it's like, if we were going to apply societal pressure into suppressing a kind of emotion, crying would not be the one I would want to suppress because it doesn't harm anyone.
Right.
And so it's weird how we judge one as being, weak or, silly or whatever, and then these other ones which have real negative externalities on society and then also the person doing it. It's kind of interesting how we're willing to tolerate certain things as what boys do, and then you'll make a boy feel bad for doing a different thing even though it's not harming anyone.
Yeah, that's where, but we've made so much progress, I think, on those fronts,
Yeah.
where actually it's almost at the point now where if you're not
Sure.
getting tearful or expressing your emotions in some way or sharing your vulnerabilities, that you're not taken seriously. So
Yes.
there can be a degree of performance in that now.
Yes,
And so I actually think
sure.
there's a danger that you replace one performance, which was the sort of stiff upper lip, not going to express anything,
Yes.
with the kind of like, let me share with you my struggles with depression or get tearful. And
It's like a
right.
weird form of honor culture in its own way.
Yeah, and we just adjust to the new
Yeah.
status symbols around
Yes.
that. Now, but what's interesting about this idea of the expressions that you have around emotions and how they might vary somewhat, it gets us into this debate about the classic nature-nurture
Yeah.
type debate. And one of the things I find frustrating about the discussion of sex differences is that people interpret any claim that there could be some differences in psychology between men and women as biological determinism,
Yeah.
or somehow saying one is better than the other, or as saying that culture is less important. And I take exactly the opposite view. My reading of this is that if you do understand that there are some differences, say in propensity towards aggression, right, or whatever you want to, or propensity towards driven sexuality, so being driven more by sex,
Yeah.
right. If you think that those are actual differences that are not just socialized,
Yeah.
that doesn't make culture less important. It makes it more important for the reasons you just said.
You have to
which
work
is, like,
on it.
You have to work on it.
Yeah.
And we have to decide as a society to some extent, like which of these, under which circumstances,
Yeah.
is it appropriate to encourage the expression of that, and which is it not? And so you might actually think that maybe a better example is risk-taking.
Yeah.
Like, pretty clear evidence that risk appetite or risk-taking, but is higher among boys and men than it is among women and girls. And there's lots of examples of that. The one I've been looking at recently is that at every single age group, boys and men are at least twice as likely to die from drowning as women and girls.
Yeah.
Right? But just to drown a lot more. And there's no evidence that there's a particular difference in skill level around swimming, swimming ability or anything.
Yeah.
And when it's at every age group, it's got to be about risk-taking. In
Yeah.
fact, there's this... I live in rural East Tennessee now.
Yeah.
There's a bridge near us where the local teenagers gather, and one group of teenagers jumps off this bridge into the lake, and it's a long drop. I've looked at it and thought about it and said, no, it's a long drop.
Yeah.
So one group of teenagers line up and jump in, and then another group of teenagers watch them doing it.
Yeah.
Have a guess.
Yes.
Right. And so, of course, they're jumping off high bridges. They're kind of more likely to drown. Now, if it's true that at the average there's a bit more risk appetite or risk-taking behavior among boys, is that good or bad? Yes. Right? If it means that you do crazy, silly things, you risk your own life or other people's lives, or you try drugs or whatever, sure, bad. But if it's actually... like we need people to go and parachute into wildfires to put them out, or maybe a bit of entrepreneurship, etc. If at the average, that means that you've got a little bit more of that in one group than another. And the question is, are these differences being encouraged to be expressed in a pro-social way?
When it cuts both directions, you had a tweet that I really liked where you were saying there was like more female fighter pilots than male nurses or
Kindergarten teachers.
Yes, something like that.
Yeah.
And obviously it took work as a society to get the number of one of those up. we had to focus on it.
Yes.
And it's great, and we're reaping the benefits of it. I've been doing this series of lectures at the Naval Academy, and you meet these like young women who would not have been in the audience 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago. And every year there's more.
Yeah.
And those are the best and the brightest of the country. It's fantastic that we've done that work. You think of the invisible graveyard of amazing kindergarten teachers that we don't have because they weren't encouraged to do that. They were encouraged to work. Some man was encouraged to work on Wall Street, and he hates it, but he would have been the greatest kindergarten teacher of all time. But just as a society, we didn't push him in that direction. So I think you go, look, there's certain proclivities or predilections. And then as a society, like we do with all things, we decide, what do we want to incentivize? What do we want to culturally incubate? And then we go to work on that.
Yeah, and we try and get to a society where we can feel pretty confident that whatever patterns emerge are genuinely the result of us giving people equal opportunities. But the trouble is that there is one group, more conservatives, let's say, who insist that these biological differences are so great that they would say, well, of course only 3% of kindergarten teachers are male. What do you think? And men are into things, right? And of course only 15% of engineers are women, because like women are into people. Right? And so they use these real differences in average proclivities to justify extraordinary differences in actual behavior. But then on the other side, there are people who say, until everything's 50-50, then we won't be at a real equality, because the only reason that men might be more interested in engineering than women, or that men might be more interested in the Navy, can only be socialization, right? And of course, the truth is in the middle.
Sure.
The truth is that, like, I think under conditions of absolute equality of opportunity, do I think 50% of kindergarten teachers would be male and 50% of fighter pilots or smoke jumpers, the people that go into wildfires, do I think they would be female?
Right.
No.
Right.
But I got to tell you, it's a damn sight more than 3%, right? So what is the number? And actually there are some studies that kind of look at this, and depending on the occupation, it's probably maybe 25% or 30% or something, right? But so we can't make a shibboleth of 50% if we think there are any differences underlying it. But as soon as you say that, people are, oh, okay, so you're saying women can't be engineers. And I say, hold on, my son is a 5th grade teacher and my sister-in-law is an engineer. Yeah. And if anybody came along and said, well, men can't really teach
you guys have to switch.
School, right? I mean, no, sorry. So exactly. Sorry. Something went wrong here. Do you mind switching? I would be, of course, furious, as would they.
Well, and look, one of the most basic laws of economics is the law of comparative advantage. You want a society where people are doing the thing they are best equipped to do. Yes. And in fact, it doesn't really matter what the averages are. What matters is that each individual is doing their main thing. There's a Theodore Roosevelt quote that I love that I think about all the time when people get in these silly debates about these things. I think I heard it in the Ken Burns documentary, and I interviewed him recently. But someone was pointing out to Theodore Roosevelt, who was a supporter of women's suffrage. They were, what about all the differences between men and women? And he said there may be differences between men and women, but he's like, these pale in comparison between the differences between men and other men. Mm-hmm. And so there might be all sorts of different, in large enough data sets, you might see all these different patterns emerge, but it doesn't matter to you as the individual. That's why I think so. Yeah. There is this other conservative fascination of like, are there race-based IQ differences? And they insist on, like, we need to talk about this. And it's like, show me one company that's big enough that these percentages would even matter to them. Do you know what it would have, what would you possibly do with this information? Effectively nothing. What we should have is a society that goes, you as an individual seem to be showing a predilection for X. Mm-hmm. We want to support and enable and help you realize that potential.
Yeah, because that's what the economists call statistical discrimination, where you assume that, like, because on average, women are more likely to be kindergarten teachers. And, and my own son has faced discrimination trying to go into elementary education, right? As has my sister-in-law into engineering, and that's a form of discrimination we don't want. And I can't find who said this. I wish it was Hans Rosling, whose book Factfulness I really like. Yeah. And I don't know who said this, but the line is that so many of society's problems are caused by an unwillingness or inability to imagine overlapping distributions. So in other words, take a trait, whatever it is, and the distribution. So let's talk about women a bit more into people, men a bit more into things. That's true. Sure. But wow, do those distributions overlap? Most of the sex differences that you were interested in, there's going to be huge overlap. So an example would be, let's take height as an example. I use this as a good, the statement that men are taller than women
Yeah.
is one that most people understand to mean that on average men are taller than women. Most people don't think that statement means all men are taller than all women, right?
Yeah.
They realize that there are some tall women and some shorter men, right?
Yeah.
But they also know that the distributions are different. So they're different, but they overlap. The question then becomes like, what are we talking about? How much does it overlap? And does it matter?
Yeah.
So back to the kind of, let's say on average, women cry a bit more and men spit a bit more, which apparently is also true, right? Do we care? No.
Yeah.
If there's something else, which is like tendency towards risk taking or something, do we care? Well, we certainly don't care when it comes to like hiring people.
Yeah.
Like we wouldn't say to a woman who wants to be a fighter pilot or parachute smoke jump, right? No, sorry, women can't do that.
Yeah.
But we might actually look at the distributions and say, look, the fact that most of the people parachuting out of serviceable airplanes into wildfires are men doesn't necessarily mean that there's a sexism at work. It might just mean there's some selection based on it, right?
And to most of us, none of this has anything to do with how we live. Like, I have two boys. That's my problem. I don't have statistical boys.
Yeah.
And just like
you have an N
don't
of
have
two.
statistical, statistical girls.
Yes.
And so I think describing what these things are as average is kind of a distraction from you've got these two kids in front of you that you've got to figure out how to make through the world, and understanding that because of how we saw things in the past or because of these statistical averages, you might have this obstacle or that obstacle that you have to think about is the main thing.
In a way, I think the purpose of recognizing differences at the average, say in sex, is to then be able to ignore them when it comes to the individual. And the reason I say that is because if there are differences at the average, then what it means is that we don't inadvertently end up treating someone as there's something wrong with them because we have this inadvertent like default. So
one of the bed of Procrustes or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, one of the things I worry about in the school system, for example, is that no one's fault, but ends up treating boys a bit like malfunctioning girls, right? Because there's this like, if you have this implied standard of how to behave, how to sit still, what kind of learning, physicality, etc., and the kind of median person you've got in mind there is like the median girl, right? Then
because that's who's doing best,
right? And most of the teachers are female, and so on. So then you're going to look at how the boy behaves and go, what's wrong with him? In just the same way, by the way, that in a corporate culture that's mostly male. Right, and I don't know. Let's say this woman's a bit more emotionally expressive, or whatever it is. Right, she just act like. So we have a workplace that still tends to treat many women like malfunctioning men, but we have a school system that treats kind of boys like malfunctioning girls. And the point of recognizing there are some differences is to then kind of go, cool. Now can we get on with it?
Well, you talk about this in the book, and I'd heard you talk about it, so it actually affected a decision we made. Like you were looking at some of the data that says like boys tend to succeed better if you hold them back a year before they enter. And so my oldest, his birthday lined up with that, and we ended up doing it. He started a year later.
Okay.
Now, if he had been crushing it and was we didn't go, oh, the data says you're a boy, you should start school a year earlier. It's like you have a data point, and then you measure you compare that data point with the specific person or kid that you have in front of you. And then you go, is this helpful? Are you the exception or are you representative? And then you sort of proceed from there.
Yeah, it's I'd say similar. How old are your kids now?
8 and 5.
Yeah, so once you get into the high school years, middle and high school, which is where you see some of these gender gaps really opening up, something similar happens there too, which is where you see this huge gap in GPA between boys and girls, but no gap in SAT.
Oh.
Right. So there's no gender gap on standardized tests, SAT or ACT, but huge ones in grades.
So it's just behavior mostly, or togetherness.
Yes, exactly. And so in some ways, I wish I'd known when my kids were younger what I know now, which is that actually it just does take boys a little bit longer at the average to develop some of those skills, which are the GPA skills, right? Which are turn in your homework skills, right? Which is very difficult for
don't just shove it all on the bottom of your back.
Yeah, I mean, I people who don't believe in sex differences, I'd say go into the average 8th or 9th grade classroom and ask them to open up their bags.
Yes.
Right, and the girls just much more likely to be organized, neatly labeled, and the boys it's like a controlled explosion.
Yeah.
Right, where's your homework? And I just the ball down. And of course, these are stereotypes, and everyone kind of goes, yeah. But the reason, but they're kind of true.
Yeah.
And so what that means is that if you have a school system or a college admissions process, that only leans on one, then it's inevitably going to be a bit more gendered. So what's interesting, we have data on this now because a bunch of colleges went test optional, especially during the pandemic, where they actually said, we don't need your SAT or ACT score anymore, right? We're just going to do it on GPA and other things, where the girls are killing it compared to the boys. And the main result was they became 4 percentage points more female almost overnight, those colleges.
Because you changed what you were measuring and you didn't think about how that there might be a sort of, not an injustice, but a preference in what you were measuring.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It wasn't clearly, and actually it was definitely not the main point of the policy. It was actually trying to get more kids of color in and kids from poorer backgrounds, which it didn't really seem to work. But obviously, if you've got these two different variables and you've got a big gender gap on one and actually no gender gap on the other, and you take that one out, then of course you're going to skew that way, which is, again, not necessarily to say you shouldn't do it. Yeah. But it's an example of how, and it used to go the other way, by the way. I mean, one of the reasons that we moved towards more like GPA and continuous assessment was because at the average, boys seemed to just dial it in a bit better when it came to high stakes, competitive, standardized tests. Boys just seemed to they like that. They just do a bit better. And girls didn't do quite as well. And so there's been a shift to say, well, hold on, we can't just do these high-stakes one-day tests, right?
Yeah.
How about we measure what they're doing all year? And that's a perfectly appropriate thing to do. But again, it might come back to just trying to get a balance here.
Yeah.
We don't want an education system that tilts more towards, classically male attributes, but nor do we want it the other way around.
Well, we can see it in a lot of different ways. Paul Tuff wrote a book a couple years ago, and the marshmallow test.
Yeah. And
he pointed out this thing about the marshmallow test that I never thought about, which was like when you give the marshmallow test to, say, a kid in the inner city, he or she is like, just give me the marshmallow. I don't trust you.
Yeah.
And so the idea of like your cultural experience sometimes we're just not thinking about the assumptions inherent on what we're measuring or looking at. And so if you live in a rules-based, cause and effect world, if somebody says, hey, if you defer gratification here, it'll be better for you, you're like, okay. But if you've been screwed over or deceived or you're not sure you're going to live till tomorrow, you're like, give me the marshmallow now. I want to get out of here.
Yeah, it's only worth deferring gratification if you can be reasonably confident that will pay off. And maybe Paul talked about this, but someone replicated the marshmallow test, but with an additional condition. Did you know? Maybe he talked about this. So you get the marshmallow test. How long can you wait for the marshmallow, basically? And then if you wait longer, you get 2 or whatever it is. And so it's a measure of deferring gratification. But then someone then repeated it, and they did something very interesting. They said, okay, we're going to do the marshmallow. Before they did that, they said to the kids, we're going to start in a minute, but while you're waiting, do some coloring.
Yeah.
And then they gave them a bunch of broken pencils. And they said, then they said, I'll bring you some new pencils. And half of the kids, they brought them new pencils. Half of the kids, they didn't bring them new pencils. They said, oh no, sorry, we didn't have any.
They lied to them.
Yeah. Right. Then they ran the marshmallow
Yes.
test. And guess what?
Yeah.
Guess what?
Right.
The kids were like, I don't trust you.
It's
Because
a
you
rational decision.
said you'd bring me new pencils and you didn't. So I'm definitely not waiting for another marshmallow. And so it was just it baked into the experiment was this, I go, well, how about if we change the kids' assumptions about how reliable you are and how reliably their deferring of gratification is in fact going to deliver this thing. And what they found was that difference between the kids who'd been promised the pencils and didn't get them and those who'd been promised them and did get them was bigger than anything they'd found in a previous marshmallow test.
The idea, we say like trust the process, right? And I've thought about that in my own life. Like the reason I can trust a process on a book is that I've been through the process and it's paid off for me. Trusting the process on the first book was tough because I didn't actually know if you stick with the thing, you come out the other side. And so discipline, understanding discipline just as understanding like reading a hard book or working, doing your schoolwork. We're expecting them to understand at a young age when they're already struggling with cause and effect. we're expecting them to trust a process that they have never actually experienced before, and expecting them to do it on the word of adults, some of whom they respect and trust, and others they don't respect and trust. And you think about it, it's like if you come from a family that has that is demonstrable evidence of hard work pays off, you're gonna have an easier time trusting a process or being self-disciplined than someone who has not, or someone who's surrounded by people who live in the moment and don't. So it is interesting, just like what we're asking of people, and not really thinking about what a leap of faith we are asking of them.
Yeah, and actually, I've been thinking about this quite a lot recently in the context of optimism and pessimism, and what's happening to young people especially, and this real quite steep decline in optimism. And I think that's a profound cultural shift, because for exactly the reasons that you're just identifying, which is for people to feel like the future is going to be reliably better than the present, conditional on doing certain things, is what leads you to invest, to work, to defer gratification, to make difficult choices, to start a business, to go away to college, whatever it is, right?
For a down payment,
whatever it is, right? That you're making it, and actually, capitalism's built on that presumption.
Yes,
right. Actually, the idea that like things are going to go up, things are going to get better, is in some ways the psychological engine of capitalism. And so I've actually come to believe that the real enemy of capitalism is not socialism; it's pessimism.
I would totally agree.
If you stop believing that investment's going to pay off, that hard work's going to pay off, the future can be reasonably reliably better, I think you're in real trouble then. And so, and it's
this is the self-defeating nature of what you call dream hoarding, right? So why are young people moving more and more to the left, less and less believer in institutions, capitalism, etc.?
Young women, I should just say.
Show me where it's working.
Yeah.
Like show me where it's. But I would say for Gen Z or my generation, period, like. Who is it? Show me when the last time it really worked the way that it worked for their parents. Of course, as a general trend, I think they're going to be much more skeptical of these things than people who watched it work for their parents, watched it work for their older siblings, aunts and uncles, etc., and then can sense that it's working for them. Let's say you take 2000 to today. Show me show me some market efficiency or market-based solution that we're all widely agreed as a culture worked great. I can't see that. What
about online shopping? What about so is the world worse or better on net since Amazon? I think it's better. But
I would say it's better in many ways, but if you were a kid who now doesn't have the experience of retail or malls, or it also hollowed out a bunch of stuff. So and I think kids are aware of that in a way that maybe in the past we definitely talk about the costs of tech in a way that maybe we wouldn't have in past generations about certain innovations.
I really think one of the most difficult things for us to do as parents and as a society is to get the balance right between recognizing that even net positive changes in society can have negative byproducts and consequences, and to responsibly deal with those. This is actually relevant to my work, which is the rise of women and the changes in society are amazing, but it has dislocated a lot of men. And just we can think that big change good, but look what's happening to B. Same with the Amazon example. And so as a parent, but also just as a policy person or someone working in this space, I was trying to get the balance right between being honest about these downsides and these troubling trends, but without catastrophizing and without falling into the self-fulfilling trap, I think, of making a whole generation think the world is so screwed that it's not really worth doing anything. I worry a lot about that. I worry that there's a generation who have been over-taught the downsides of recent changes, have internalized some of that into a now kind of form of pessimism. And I don't know if you saw this recent World Values Survey showing that actually quite uniquely young people, young adults in the US are now less happy than middle-aged adults, which is a reversion of the normal U-shape, right? And more so than in other countries too. So there's something happening around this idea of optimism among young people in the US too. And I think I worry a lot about the nature of even just political rhetoric now, where you sort of look in vain for the optimists, because there's a general agreement that we're all going to hell in a handcart, that it's either the climate's going to kill us, democracy is in peril, it's American carnage, it's whatever. And so the competition in politics right now is like, who can tell the most gloomy story?
Yes.
Right? On the left, it'll be like, since Dobbs, Handmaid's Tale is literally around the corner, and the climate's going to kill you.
Yeah.
And racism and sexism and etc. So, and then on the right, you've got American carnage. The church is going to get destroyed. The immigrants are killing everybody. Whatever. Right. So there's this kind of competing dystopianism in politics right now, and then you wonder why young people are so sad.
No, it's a hard thing as a parent not to protect their innocence and to not make them cynical before they should be cynical in some ways. But I do think there is generational. Like if you went from 2000 to 2024, there is, I think, a general observable trend of what we were talking about with the delayed gratification of, here, let me bring you some new pencils, and then not bringing the new pencils.
Yeah.
So I get that sort of sense as someone who feels like the exception to a lot of that. Like I got lucky. I left college without debt, and I left early, so right before the financial crisis. So I feel like I got in under the wire. I moved to Austin 10 years ago before the housing market exploded.
Yeah.
I feel like I like either walked through raindrops or snuck under the wire on a bunch of things. So like I have a house. I have a career I like. I'm not saddled with a bunch of things where I could see how if it had gone in just a slightly different direction, I'd be pretty upset. And I think understanding that energy, it's not something you explain. You can't just tell, like you can't just gaslight a generation about that. I think you have to really show. It's funny to me. I'll give you an example. I think coming out of COVID, we should have an increased sense of our capacity and our ability to solve really tough, complex problems.
Yeah.
But instead, we've taken especially young men, taken the exact opposite lesson.
And why do you think that is? Why has that happened?
Well, I was going to ask you about that. I think a big part of it is because a bunch of online grifters have decided that is a much more salient message to send. Like, I think it's easier to be a demagogue than it is to be someone who appeals to reason and a population's better angels.
Yeah, plus I guess you could layer onto that social media, which thrives a bit more on the kind of conflict. I mean, I think there's the very controversial figure Andrew Tate, who's like the misogynist online influencer. It was very interesting when you look at his business model. He was incentivizing people to comment on and clip from him, but he was incentivizing them every bit as much if they were attacking him as if they were supporting him. So that was someone who he understood the algorithm of short form video content very quickly and understood that fighting is the point, and therefore extremism is the point, and so clearly you get led in those directions. It's interesting. I mean, partly I think it's this trust in institutions thing. It's like, are the institutions working for me? And maybe it's also simply that, particularly for young men, this question about their role, this question about how to be in the world is relatively new. Like I think that the script used to be pretty clear. Right? That was the good thing, if I can risk saying this, about the old model of my parents' model of the kind of breadwinner, provider, husband and father, husband, father, provider, all bundled together, and then the kind of homemaker, child rearing kind of It
was not just clear, but it was centuries of stasis about that clarity.
It wasn't even a question.
Yeah.
And so when my own dad lost, he was the main breadwinner. They had a very equal marriage. They still have a very equal marriage, even when they were raising us, but still now. But like when he lost his job, when he was unemployed, there was a question. Like he said to me once, he said, well, my job is to get another job now to look after you. Because I asked him why he was still shaving and putting a shirt on. And he's like, well, because I have to get another job. Now, I'm not saying that wasn't without its stresses and strains. It certainly was, but it did have the advantage of clarity. And what we've done, I think we've torn up those old scripts and replaced the one for women with quite a positive script about empowerment and autonomy, you go girl, etc., which is fantastic. We've torn up the old male script about, well, you're going to be the provider, you're going to protector and provider. So we've torn that up and we've replaced it with
nothing.
And that is the space that a lot of the online influencers will come in, and what they'll say is, and that's why we have to go back. Right? Because, and that's an appealing idea for men who are like, I am completely lost. I don't know what to do. I know what I'm supposed to not do. I know what I'm supposed to not say. but I'm not quite clear what I am supposed to do, or why society or family, whatever, actually needs me specifically. And that sense of feeling unneeded, I think, is driving a lot of this male malaise. I think it's making a lot of men dislocated. I think there's a lot of retreat going on because of that scriptlessness, right? They're improvising, and it's really, really hard to improvise a self.
Yes.
And it's easy for those who are fortunate enough maybe to have education and economic resources to just say, well, just get with the program.
Right.
Well, I'm sure that you and I could agree that we're like total gender egalitarians, and we've got these modern marriages, and we're figuring it out, and we're in touch with our emotions, and like, what's wrong with you? Right. And it's much easier for people who are in positions of high economic resource to do that.
Yeah.
And I've come to believe that this lack of empathy for the real problems of many men, especially those with the least economic power, has created a massive vacuum in our culture and in our politics, and that has been exploited. But that's our fault for not. I mean, Jordan Peterson's he's a Canadian psychologist. I know you know who he is, but I found it extraordinary, his success.
Yes.
Despite his brilliance on many kind of fronts, and I have strong disagreements with him about certain things, because if you read his book, 12 Rules for Life, which kicked around our house for a bit, like most kind of sons raised in mostly liberal households, my boys obviously went through a slightly countercultural phase. It's anodyne in its advice. Why was he so successful? Because he just made these young men feel someone had seen and heard them. That's literally all he did. He just communicated empathy. And it turned out there's this massive reservoir of men who just needed that.
The question to me is not, why is Jordan Peterson so popular? It's, why are there not more Jordan Petersons? Like, why? Like, what is he doing? He's charismatic. He's not condescending. He is taking great cultural myths, stories, and ideas and making them accessible. He's using the tools. He's meeting people where they are. All that's wonderful. I think he's also a fascinating arc in how you can be eaten by the algorithm, and fame is a toxic drug. I think
pulled one.
I think watching his descent into what I don't think it's an exaggeration to say is essentially madness at this point. I think he's lost his mind. But the playbook there, I think, it's not something that should be mocked or criticized. It's something that should be emulated by people who want to integrate these people into society. And it's easy. It's easy, if you get it, to be like, these are the assumptions, these are the personality traits, these are things you need to be successful in this sort of new modern world. And you can almost go like, But what if that doesn't occur to you naturally? What if you didn't have parents that modeled some of these things for you? What if you have kind of a cultural dyslexia or a learning disability? It's hard for you to go, in a world where women are equal, or in some cases the predominant, like in publishing where I operate, and you too. Publishing is one of those industries where women are vastly overrepresented in a way that I don't think is positive or negative. It just is. But so if you can't understand the culture that it's going to create in that industry and figure out how to work in it, you're not going to succeed, right? And so how do you teach people to adjust and operate in environments that are maybe different than the one they grew up in? That's a hard thing to do. And I think empathy is a key thing, but then also understanding that your lack of empathy is creating a market for someone who has a more exploitative form of empathy to play to those grievances or that disorientation.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that a slightly more maybe self-critical way to think about this too is how anybody that does start to talk about these issues kind of facing boys and men runs the risk potentially of being thrown under that bus. I mean, it's why everyone lined up to tell me not to write this book.
Yes.
Right? And why I couldn't get a publisher. Because this is just, people are going to think you're some red pill, some misogynist men's rights activist, right? Which is a classic self-fulfilling prophecy. Because I said to people, if the only people allowed to write and talk about this are the people like that, then we shouldn't be surprised if the only people talking about this are the people like that. So maybe boring centrist people like me with charts. Right. One of the mottos of my new think tank is keep it boring. And my son overheard me saying that. As opposed to
polemical.
Yeah. My son overheard that and said, "What's your motto?" I said, "Keep it boring." And he said, "Well, you're the man for that job, Dad." Ha ha. See, they're funny, aren't they?
It's great.
It's great. But what's interesting is that it's a bit self-fulfilling. So what can happen is if somebody who does start to raise these awareness of these issues is almost kind of instantly castigated as being a reactionary, and then they find more audiences among reactionaries, and they find themselves pilloried maybe on the left, and the way to make a living and build an audience is among the people who are more reactionary, then you've just created the very situation which you're claiming to lament. And so the space that I think we have to fill here is to be able to have an empathetic, data-based conversation about the real problems of boys and men, and not allow the algorithm or the disagreements or the fringe people to push you one way or the other. Because what happens, I've really noticed this with a lot of men, and I'll give you one specific example, which is they start off working on these issues in good faith, and they're pretty calm, and they've got the data, and they point out things like the suicide rate among men is 4 times higher, and it's gone up by a third among young men since 2010, and et cetera, et cetera. And then they repeat that message over and over again, and they never get anywhere. And everyone just keeps telling them they're wrong, or you would say, or eye rolling, and they get radicalized, and then they get angry. And then they start to express themselves with a really angry affect. In fact, Ezra Klein had this line about Jordan Peterson where he said his affect is that of a clenched fist. And I don't think it was, but you do see that happening. And you see it, especially on the right, kind of more reactionary figures. There's this kind of very clenched fist, kind of reactionary, kind of fighter mentality around it. But to some extent, we create that by not having these alternatives, which are more about a helping hand, or by just empathetically saying, yes, these problems are real and we should be addressing them. And so to some extent, the ecosystem, like, it's very easy to say, oh, these guys, they all go to the right and then they get the reactionaries. But maybe to some extent we push them to the right by not acknowledging some of what they're saying being true. And saying, oh, interesting, why are so many young men flocking to Jordan Peterson? And it might not be that they're all misogynists who want women to be barefoot and in the kitchen. There might be something else going on here. And this unwillingness to kind of look in the mirror and say, maybe something's going wrong in our culture here that is allowing that opportunity. And so maybe we need to do something differently rather than just blaming him and or blaming the men who are attracted to him.
Well, I think you need a strong sense of self and a comfort with oneself, and also a strong sense of focus. These are, to me, all very important, I think, traits that would go into what the Stoics would call sort of command of the self. And so I remember you and I we were on that interview with the Free Press, and we're all in agreement, and then someone's like, and then, they're giving transgender surgery to prisoners or something. And you and I both said, we don't actually need to talk about that at all. Let's just talk about this. And there is this, I think, in a world of so much information where you can always find something objectionable or weird or extreme. If you are easily kind of provoked or distracted, you're always going to find something to be outraged about. Right. And so and there's always going to be someone who understands that content is easier to monetize and succeed with. And so you need kind of a calm demeanor and a strong sense of self and purpose, I think, as a person, but then definitely as someone who's trying to talk about sensitive or difficult issues. So you're not just constantly getting sucked into stuff. You need that, or I think this information ecosystem that we live in, it will eat you alive. You're easy pickings.
I think that's interesting, and I think about that quite a bit in my own work and how I present around it and how I talk about it. And one of the things that I have come to believe very strongly is that unless this feels uncomfortable, probably not doing it right. And if there are people who come into this conversation with skepticism, particularly women, like, if there's not a degree of skepticism with which you're approaching this whole conversation about why it's time to pay more attention to boys and men, I don't trust you quite as much, because it should be a difficult conversation. And I not only acknowledge the difficulty with it, I honor that difficulty, and I actually trust someone a lot more who says, you know what, I was really skeptical about this. And I'm still got some issues around it. But you know what? Actually, there is some stuff here. And although this is difficult, I actually do think we need to do more here. And how do we do that without leaving women behind? And this is really hard. And anybody that thinks this is easy is not doing it properly, because they're either like, eye roll, tiny violin, are you kidding me? I'm out of here. Or they're like, hell yeah, men are struggling because those feminists have taken over. And so join me on the barricades of the reactionary right. Like, okay, fine. Anybody that thinks this is that easy is not serious.
Yes.
Because this is difficult culturally. It's difficult in terms of language. It's difficult in terms of issue selection. It's doing non-zero sum thinking. It's really hard, right? And so anybody that's finding this easy, I probably don't want you in the room.
Yeah.
All right. You're probably on one side or the other because, especially at this moment in history, where we've still got so much more to do in many cases for women and girls, and so many women have had to face so much discrimination.
Sure.
In my lifetime,
to
get here, that asking them to just go, oh yeah, sorry, do you mind doing boys and men now? Like, you've had your 3 seconds of attention. Can we go back to our 10,000 years of worrying about men again, right? And that should be hard.
Yeah,
I find it a little bit hard.
Yeah, I mean, I've been saying that, like, the main challenge of our time is to not let the crazy people turn you into a crazy person. Like, just how do you not get sucked in on either side? How do you not become cynical? How do you not become angry? How do you not become radicalized? And it's really hard because algorithms are working on radicalizing you. Political movements are working on radicalizing you. The shittiness of the world is also working on radicalizing you. And so to sort of stick with, like, first principles, to stick with what's true, to stick with a kind of an open-heartedness is a feat of strength, you know, like focusing on and not being pulled in this direction. I think this is a skill we have to work on and cultivate as a society, both as I think people who make stuff, like the idea of not falling prey to audience capture is important, but that's kind of inside baseball. I think most people have to worry about not getting sort of captured or radicalized by whatever, you know, they randomly click on, or also whatever they're naturally predisposed to go to. Just kind of staying in your...
Yeah, it's just a way of, and this is a very Stoic thought too, I think, is in the thick of daily life. It's in that interaction. It's in the conversation. It's obviously an intellectual challenge, but it becomes a physical challenge. It's like, and so if you're with somebody who strongly disagrees with you and is kind of arguing very strongly against you, and you find their views like absurd or they're very emotional and so on, like your cortisol starts to spike, right? Your body's reacting kind of differently, and then that affects your brain. And so, and I have these heuristics that I try and use, some of which I've learned from my intellectual hero is John Stuart Mill, the 19th century liberal philosopher who I wrote a book about. And he had this lovely line that he used in a letter that I try and keep in my mind, especially in those moments where you're having a difficult conversation with someone or someone's really coming at you. He had this line where he said, like, if someone's strongly disagreeing with you about something, they're almost certainly trying to get to the same mountaintop as you. They've just chosen a different path. And I have that image in my mind, and I try and keep it in my mind, which is like, it's very unlikely this person I'm arguing with doesn't want similar things in the long run, right? Very unlikely. Possibly. But let's assume that, let's just say we're arguing about like boys and men or kind of whatever, right? They probably want to reduce rates of male suicide, increase men's economic outcomes, help men be more engaged fathers. They probably want that, right? I doubt they want the opposite of any of those things, right? But they think the way to do that is by giving more economic power to women, or bringing back marriage, or whatever it is. I'm disagreeing with, some of them I'm going to disagree with more than others. And I just try and think, that's a different path, and maybe I can learn something from that, right? Because it's almost never the case that you're 100% right and I'm 0% right, or vice versa. It's almost always going to be the case that you're 97% right, I'm 3%, or whatever it is. And so your job is to try and get that 3%. Not to ram the 97% down my throat, right? It's like, okay, fine. I think this person, and I really noticed this with even in family relationships, as we have a very politically diverse family, especially on the American side of my family. And what I've kind of discovered is that some of the stuff that a relative might say to me, it's wrapped in all kinds of rhetoric, so it's been more sort of from the right. It's wrapped up in rhetoric, and it's massively, and my initial reaction is like, yeah, that's completely untrue. And then I go and look at it and say, it's not completely untrue, right? It's just been so distorted along the way that when I go and look at it, I go, hey, you know what? There actually is something to that. And I wouldn't have known that otherwise. And it's made me think a little bit differently about that. IRS reform was the one that came out recently, which is so boring I won't get into it. But the point it holds, which is that you might learn something from this.
John Stuart Mill is fascinating because he's kind of obviously feels like this figure from a long time ago, but here you have a guy who's promising, he's brilliant, he's on this path, and then it kind of all falls apart. He has this mental breakdown. You could see that if that happened in 2018 or 2020, you could see, and that's when John Stuart Mill became red-pilled and went extreme in one direction. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think what's fascinating, he has this grievance, this painful childhood, the thing, it's not working for him, and he sort of actually ends up emerging from it more open-hearted, more kind, more patient. All these, I think, generally positive traits he takes out of this very painful experience. Yeah. But you could easily imagine it going the exact opposite direction.
Other way. Yeah, so in his case, he was raised red pill.
Yes.
As a utilitarian by his father, who was a massive utilitarian. He was the, quotes, godson of Jeremy Bentham, the father of utilitarianism. So he was, and his breakdown, it was a complete loss of faith. Yeah. Right. So he's raised with this incredibly clear philosophy. It answers all the questions. Yeah. You know, gives you a very clear agenda, and then it just, it's like it blew up for him. And then suddenly he's in this new place where he's questioning and opening, and essentially realizing that there are no easy answers. There is no political philosophy or religion or anything that answers all the questions for you. Life's a journey, and it's a painful one, and it's a learning one, and it's a develop. And so what happens is that if you even look at the metaphors that he uses before and after this, and he was very young. But before, it's like the metaphors were much more about machines. Yeah, like they were very mechanical. Our society works as a machine, and the great utility. And after that, almost all of his metaphors are organic.
Yes, he falls in love with nature. He spends time outside. This is like poetry becomes a part of his life.
It's that poetry thing, but it's about growth. And if you kind of look, he uses plants. He uses growth. He talks about being stunted. He talks about sunlight, and so he uses his botanical interest. But it becomes his political philosophy too, which is just intrinsically developmental. And intrinsically about different individuals need different circumstances in which to thrive, but it's all about growth. Yeah. And so it becomes, it's not a small shift, because it's going from basically treating individuals as like cogs in a machine to be made as happy as possible, right? Here we go. Like Jeremy Bentham famously, Bentham famously said, I don't care if you're a soldier or a slave or whatever it is, I just care how happy you are. Yeah. Right? And I was like, I'm not cool with that. Yeah. And instead, it's this really incredibly, I would say, although he remained very non-believing in his own life, it has almost a theological feel to it, which is this ultimate dignity of the human individual and the developmental potential of each individual, requiring a society that will recognize it in all its diversity.
Men and women.
Oh, he's the father of British feminism. Yeah. He introduced a one-word change to the 1867 Reform Bill. Yes. To change man to person. And overnight, it would have enfranchised women half a century before they actually did. And when they actually did in 1928 pass the giving women full equality, the women's rights campaigners who were in the gallery of Parliament when the bill was passed, they left Parliament, got armfuls of flowers, and went down the embankment to Mill's statue and laid flowers in his honor for the work that he had done for women. And it's entirely consistent with this idea that back to where we were a while ago, about an individual flourishing. And like, even if there are some differences on group averages, what matters is the dignity of the individual. Yeah,
I sort of take it that his upbringing was he was like an athlete. It was like all about him. It was about personal optimization. Yes. He was the machine. Yes. You know, his dad was Earl Woods, or, like was trying to create this superhuman, and it all falls apart, and he remakes himself as this much more, what's that quote about happiness is a door that opens outwards? Yeah. He becomes an outward-focused individual in a totally different way. And to me, that's a recipe for sort of human flourishing and a sense of gender. Where, I mean, he's clearly a man. He's married to a woman, but he just has this much more expansive definition of, like, the change. He doesn't try to change that to say men and women. He tries to change that law to say person. Yes. Like, it's just this sort of removal of the distinction, and just whatever you are, whoever you are, you deserve these natural rights as a person.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And also, perhaps the most inspiring thing about people like him is what you were saying a moment ago, is almost just the way of being in the world and the way of interacting with other people, and this idea of like learning from each other and openness. Yeah, that's the real change. And so, and this I think you're right that the challenge in many ways of the current era is to avoid these different gravitational pulls, right? There's the audience one, there's the political one, there's the polarization one. It almost feels like you're trying to navigate between these gravity wells, all of which are trying to pull you one direction and incentivizing you and rewarding you in some cases. That's difficult. And it's how you do it like right now. It's how you do it in each conversation. And that's very, very Millian. Like in the end, that's what Mill was about. It was about like, how do we as individuals develop those virtues to be able to engage in the world in that way. And so I think that in that sense, liberalism in the Millian sense of the term is a way of living and a way of being in the world rather than a construct, rather than a societal construct.
Somebody asked Gandhi what worried him the most, and he said hardness of the heart of the educated, or hardness of heart in the educated. And so I think it's that kind of, we could today we might say polarization or whatever, but it's the idea of like losing that openness and that connectiveness to each other that I think is, to me, the idea of virtue is so important, especially in these divisive times, because virtue is secular and non-gendered. There was one of the Stoic teachers, his name is Musonius Rufus. He writes this essay on how he says, should women be taught philosophy? And he says, yes, they should, because he's like, virtue is virtue. Excellence doesn't know gender. He said it might be different for different, the roles in society might be different. But he goes, you don't care what gender your hunting dog is. And I just, you care that it can do the thing it's supposed to do. And that can change. What the Romans thought the role of a man and woman is obviously very different than what we think of it as today. But if you go, excellence or these virtues, these traits, courage and discipline and justice and wisdom, like if we can all agree that those things are good, they're going to manifest themselves differently, but and in different roles, but they're not hyper-gendered, I don't think. And so I think if we think about it as, how do we get people to flourish and fulfill their potential as individuals? That to me is virtue is a thing we can hold up as a pursuit, as a way to do that, as long as we don't give in to the sort of very religious definition of virtue, which I think some people like, your Josh Hawleys or whatever they're trying to make virtue partisan and not accessible.
And they get, and then it's like virtue is closer in that framing, in his framing, to being like a list of proper opinions, rather than a kind of way of being and a way of being open. And I'd be interested to get your reaction to this challenge that I have, which is that I agree with everything you've just said about virtues, like beyond gender, pre-gender, whatever. And in the end, personhood is what matters. And one of the things I struggle with is, in writing this book and in creating a whole think tank around boys and men, am I making the problem worse by making more salient these differences, which in the long run I think shouldn't be that important, right? In other words, like, am I adding to this over-identification around gender, as opposed to just drawing attention to the fact that there are some problems kind of facing boys and men that aren't getting enough attention in policy circles? So it's one of the criticisms I have of my work that I find it hardest to answer, honestly, which is you're basically putting fuel on the fire of this identity politics problem by establishing this whole thing about boys and men. And my answer, for what it's worth, which I don't feel very satisfied with, is like there's this huge number of people doing great work on behalf of women and girls, and they're not going to. In fact, they're growing. There's more, right? And so, like, I'm just trying to have a little bit of stuff on boys and men, and on average it's okay, but I'm not.
You could make the same argument about historically black colleges, or is that creating? No, like there should be spaces for different people to thrive in. And look, it's a problem if you have HBCUs, because that's the only place that a young black man or woman can go.
Yeah, right.
But if it's a place that you feel attracted to going, it's a wonderful thing. And by the way, anyone should be able to go there, right? Yeah, but the idea of having those spaces, I think, is important. And I don't think pretending that gender doesn't exist is helpful to anyone, or that people might be drawn to do different things. Just like look, if you're born tall, it presents certain options. You don't have to pursue those options, but it would be weird to pretend that, there aren't certain athletic pursuits that are more possible to you as a result of this. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I think I don't I don't think, I think if you're doing it in a thoughtful way, it's additive. And then I think if you're doing it in an identity politics, sort of divisive us versus them way, then it is a problem. But I don't think that that's what you're doing at all. And I think as a person with two boys, I'm like, hey, they have a unique set of challenges. And my job and my wife's job is to help them be successful as people, which happens to include them being boys, or at least at this moment.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
Yeah. I think that's helpful. Thank you. And but it is a reminder of like what's the right space to be doing the work in. And it is much more around these real problems, these more practical issues, and not into this whole identity stuff. Like not into the what is a woman, what is a man stuff, right? I'm just like, can we talk about high school graduation rates?
Yes,
right. And so one of the deals I've made with people sometimes is like, can we talk about the Barbie movie?
Yeah.
I was like, okay, only if we can then talk about high school graduation rates in Michigan.
Yeah.
Right. Or technical high schools. Can we have that deal? Because of course, those more cultural elements, especially right now, they're just sexier, right? They're just like, and they're very lived, and everyone's into them. And what I've really admired about what a lot of the women's groups do, the kind of less the identity ones, is that they'll do really good analysis of like what's driving the gender pay gap. What happened to women's promotion chances during COVID?
Yeah.
What's the pipeline issue there? Like how do we construct cultures and systems that are a bit more female friendly? Right?
Yeah.
And they just do that well, right? And there's just really good research on that. And if something happens that seems to threaten the progress of women on any of those fronts, they're on it.
Yeah.
And they're saying, hang on, did you know the gender pay gap just got worse? Right? What's happening there?
Yeah.
Right. Let's dig in and try and figure out what's happening and see if that's a problem. And I think that's great.
Yeah.
They're not saying women versus men, women good. Like it's not a Hollywood movie. It's a policy paper, and unfortunately, the latter is quite boring.
The decision to say like,
right?
hey, I'm gonna say what I think is true, as opposed to what I think people want to hear, is a tough decision. I mean, I definitely know, like with what I talk about with Stoicism, that if I just stuck with the self-improvement, like if I just stuck with courage and discipline, it would do. I'd have a bigger audience. I'd have less disagreement, less contention than if I went to the wisdom and justice side of things, right?
Yeah.
There's where you talk about what Stoicism offers is attractive, where you talk about what Stoicism asks or obligates. But you can't just pick and choose. You can't just take the stuff you like or the stuff that's salient or the stuff that gets people excited. You have, I think, the idea of taking your profession seriously and your obligations to the truth. To me, that's a part of kind of just having a code and being a person of honor or virtue.
Yeah.
And there's going to be costs to doing that.
Do you notice that in your own metrics? Do you and then worry about audience capture? Like, do you see that like if you lean hard into the thing on how to be courageous, that suddenly you triple your male leadership and you're suddenly being quoted everywhere and you're getting invited to other stuff and you're monetizing it? Do you see that? And if so, how do you psychologically defend against those incentives?
I try to ignore the metrics for the most part.
Yeah,
I think that's it. There's an unhelpful amount of data available.
Yeah.
And then I'm asking myself always, am I being a good steward of these ideas, or am I being a good business person? And like I did this series, I'm doing the series on the cardinal virtues, I'm doing the wisdom book now. But like I went into the justice book going, this is the most important book to me personally, but probably going to sell the worst. But I didn't get into writing about an obscure school of ancient philosophy because I wanted to maximize
you want to be rich and famous.
Yeah, there's other things to focus on. So the decision to like sort of do what you think is important and to, obviously I try to optimize for the world that we're into, but I want to make sure that's not like leading. But I wonder if you've experienced this. I definitely felt, especially when the Stoicism stuff started to take off, I felt like in a way that it isn't true so much on the left-leaning stuff, I was fascinated. It was sort of a peek behind the curtain, watching this sort of right-wing conservative ecosystem sort of, once you get, like, I could feel a gravitational pull of contacts, conferences, funding sort of there for the take. So I think JD Vance is a fascinating person, and watching that's captured in a different sense where like it was very who he was in 2016 versus who he is in 2024 is a fascinating evolution to me. And I think it's part and parcel of this this system that looks to sort of co-opt and bring people in. And I imagine you felt some of that gravitational pull on your work a little bit.
A little bit, but it's very odd, actually. Not perhaps in the way you might expect. I feel like I'm probably right now between these different gravitational pulls,
Yes.
and I use the sort of fringe attacks as a useful data point, right? So I did a panel with UN Women, and we had some kind of funding from Melinda French Gates, and so Q attacks from right, oh yeah, fine,
Yeah.
he's become a lefty, he just thinks men should deconstruct themselves to be
Yeah.
better feminists, right? And then I'll I'll publish something that's kind of more around that's around marriage or something like that, and then or very critical of the current administration's failure to acknowledge this, and then you'll get the same from the left. So he just men he just doesn't want men to have to compete and wants to go right. And okay, good, probably about right.
Yeah.
But so I actually think right now I feel pretty well balanced between the two, but I don't have the same issue that the podcasters have, or that people who are in that space have. And I'm interested to know your view about this, because I've noticed that when I'm doing this work, when I think about the podcasts that I'm going to go on and talk about, men quite often, they tend to be a little bit more center-right, probably, whereas a lot of the broadcast stuff I do, the more kind of NPR stuff, NBC, is more women, and more kind of probably kind of center-left. And I do think that if you're in this podcast space, and a couple of the guys who are in this space have said this to me, it's like, if you just talk about stuff straightforwardly about men, male issues, you get attacked from the left. Yeah. Right? And you get applauded on the right. And you get exactly, and so the gravity.
You go towards the people that like you.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know whether you've got any observations on that, but it is, I think I can detect even in some of the podcasts that I'm kind of aware of, that like either a little bit of a pull, or them having to kind of lean very intentionally against it, and of course they want the numbers. They want an audience. That's how they make their living. Yeah. And so it feels like there's almost this dynamic that sets in, where you get attacked, and then you get defensive. Yeah. You pull that way. You get applauded. You get audience.
I actually think, again, this is probably getting inside baseball, so I'll make it less inside baseball. I was thinking about this for my kids. So, like, when I was a kid, I don't know, I would hear about something, I'd watch something on TV, I'd read an article about something. All these things existed independently. There was no enormous Borg putting these bits of data together and coming up with a profile of what it thought I was, and then serving me more and more of that. So, like, I don't know, my dad listened to Rush Limbaugh, so then I could listen to Rush Limbaugh, and then that could be a phase in my life. Or I could be into this band and then not be into that band. As opposed, there was nothing trying to make me more of that thing, to serve me more unlimited amounts of that thing. Yeah. And so now I think about it as my kids get older and they watch a YouTube video that can't exist in isolation. It's a potentially lucrative rabbit hole to pull them down. So instead of just something for them to explore, there's an incentive to draw them deeper and deeper into things. And the perilousness of that kind of keeps me up a little bit at night.
Yeah, although I'll try and make you feel a bit better about it, which is just observing my own. My boys are all in their 20s now. And just young people more generally, there's this line, I can't know if it may have been saying Epictetus, actually, someone said, you either live above or below the algorithm. Yeah. In other words, you either see it or you don't. And I've noticed that actually it's the older generations in our family that they're not aware of it.
Interesting.
Whereas my kids and their friends, they're totally aware of it.
Yeah.
And they actually help me sometimes. And like my sons, I get this thing, and they're like, well, it's because you watch that thing.
Yes.
And look where it comes from, Dad. And it's got terrible provenance, and it's awful, and like, right.
Sure.
And so, and they go through phases, etc. But to some extent, the more that you can train your kids about algorithmic sophistication, just understand the algorithm, and then they're able to control it a little bit more. They see it. Yeah. And so I think my generation is like stuck in the middle a little bit, where I'm like, I think it's the algorithm, but I don't know, how does the algorithm work again? And I'm like, why am I seeing that? And like, I'm pretty sure I'm not interested in that, but it thinks so. Whereas they're like, here's why, Dad. Yeah. Right. And here's what you need to do to control it. And so I'm pretty hopeful. Also, my younger son, his friends, they all just deleted TikTok from their phones because they're like, this is stupid. This is a waste of our time. And so that kind of learning is happening, I think. And
Yeah.
so, like, it's not like the algorithms are not going to go away. And so what we've got to do is, like,
We have to figure it out.
make sure our kids are above it and they can kind of see it coming.
No, that's a great. You're either above or you're below. You're either using it or it is using you, and you got to be conscious of that. I just think it was easier to have passing fads or phases in a world where this wasn't being tracked and recorded. Because you could be into something for 6 weeks and then change your personality in a way that you have the same, like I've had the same email address for 20 plus years now. Right. And so that's connected to all these different things, and that affects what I see and don't see in a way that if I didn't have that, or if I started, like, I wonder what would happen if I started over with everything tomorrow. I just created new accounts on everything.
Declare email bankruptcy.
Or
just like reinvent.
Cookie bankruptcy, right? And then what would I discover about myself? What patterns had I been stuck in that I didn't realize? And so that's a lot to put on a 15-year-old, that hey, the phase you went through 3 years ago is still informing what you see and think now in ways that you're not conscious of.
Yeah, although I've seen my sons definitely go through different phases and come out of them, and they seem to be able to just craft the algorithms in various ways. So, but it is an interesting thought that for all the discussion of kind of more choice and identity and fluidity and so on, maybe we had more options to be more kind of fluid in that broader sense, right? In the past, because we were less hostage to our own previous selves.
Yeah, I was talking to this woman, and she was telling me that her daughter like cut off all her hair, and that it had caused this whole problem at school in a way that was like funny, but also you could see like everyone was like, "Oh, are you?" They were like being too supportive of it instead of just being like, "You're a teenage girl who's cutting off your hair because you're being a teenage girl," not "You're a teenage girl who's not sure if you're a teenage girl." And just the sort of inability to just do that thing in a I'm sure it's always been a problem, but it was just funny to see people's sort of political algorithm is acting on her in positive and negative ways, as opposed to just seeing this as what it was, which is a bit of isolated teenage behavior. There's a real danger of overinterpretation there for sure. And I kind of look back and think I'm kind of glad that some of my periods and some of the things that I did were not overinterpreted. There's a willingness to kind of pounce a little bit and go, this. So I was like, my parents were of the generation of more benign neglect, and which I'm very grateful for. And I remember trying to explain to my father what the word parenting meant. Because I was going to some parenting. He said, "What's that word? Parenting." Parenting. I said, "Yeah, that's a verb."
And exactly. When did that become a verb? And I looked it up, and it was in the early 80s. It wasn't a verb. I said, "Well, you did parenting?" He's like, "No, we didn't."
They did supervision.
So he said we just had kids. And did all these things. But actually, one of my theories is that the turning of parent into a verb, parenting, may have been a bad turn, because just more generally that degree of surveillance and overinterpretation has become a bit of an issue, and just the space to just be like, I remember I did my hair and it's got a weird braid thing for it, like down there, and I remember my parents just being like, fine, whatever. I mean, they weren't like, So anyway,
you want to check out some books? I'll show you the bookstore.